So we're looking now at customer care and communication. So at the end of this part of the session, I want you all to be able to describe ways you'd use formal or written communication and informal or verbal communication when working with a client. Explain the difference between a quote and an estimate, and list some of the things you should give to a customer when you've completed the job. So, customer care. We're looking initially about how to present a quality image of the plumbing industry. And there's lots of things we can do to help ensure a quality image of the plumbing industry, one of which is making sure that our appearance is appropriate, we wear the appropriate clothes for the job and they're clean. We turn up on time and we treat the customer with respect, and also leave a good standard of work. All of these things will go towards leaving a good and lasting impression of the customer. So one of the best ways we can do this is making sure that we communicate effectively. And so we're going to look briefly at some do's and don'ts of what could help with effective communication. Make sure you use positive body language, look the customer in the eye. Look at the customer's body language. It gives you an idea of what they're thinking. If they look like they don't understand something, then don't just carry on. Kind of try to clarify the issue with them. And if needs be, give a fuller explanation, re-explain it in a different way. Do whatever you need to do to make sure that the customer understands what you've been telling them. Obviously do it in a polite way. Don't interrupt the customer when they're talking to you, even if it might seem like they've got the wrong end of the stick. Just wait until they've finished talking before you then explain your side. Don't use technical jargon because, like I say, I mean, customers don't always understand the plumbing terminology. You need to kind of explain it in a way that the customer will understand. And always base your communication on facts, never assume anything. So there's a couple of different ways you can communicate with your customers. You can communicate verbally, which would be considered informal communication, or with written formal communication. Verbal communication would be for less important actions, for example, sort of things like the positioning of components. If you're working in someone's house, you'd speak to them and say, look, where do you want this radiator? Which wall do you want it on? If you're working on a building site, actually a lot of that stuff would be shown in the building drawings, but if you're working in someone's house, you could discuss where they might want the position of certain components. You could explain to the customer the sort of things that you need them to do before you arrive. For example, you might sort of, if they ask you to change a kitchen sink or whatever, or fix a leak under the kitchen sink, you'd say, could you clear out the cupboard under the sink before I arrive, please? Or you could also possibly ask, if, for example, you're working on the changing a cylinder, you might ask them to clear out the airing cupboard before you arrive. You can also discuss any simple, straightforward problems or complaints. There are times where you'll need to do some formal communication. Any contract, be it sort of a contract like a quotation saying how much you're going to carry out the work for, be it an employment contract, all of these should be written formal communication. So, contract of employment, giving a quote, and confirming the work that's done by the customer. All of these would be done using written or formal communication. Some other things that might require written communication would be major alterations to the specification or to the quote. Sometimes you come across things that you didn't expect, and if asbestos, for example, and you can't carry out the job within the agreed price, you then need to sort of discuss that with with the customer, and they could either, you can leave the job and they could bring somebody else in, or which means you wouldn't get paid, or you could agree an alteration to the quote. Confirming the quote, which is done by the customer. Commissioning reports. Commissioning reports are basically once you've finished the job. For example, if you're fitting a boiler, you would commission the boiler, which means bring it into service essentially, and then as part of that, you'd sort of fill in some paperwork, and you'd give these to the customer. These are written communication. And also, if there was complicated problems or sort of major complaints, they would be done using a letter normally. With formal communication. So quotes and estimates. Quick look at the difference between quotes and estimates. I always say an estimate is a guesstimate. An estimate is an approximate cost of how much they think that the job will cost. It's useful to be able to give estimates because obviously sort of the jobs often take longer than you expect, and in some occasions take shorter than you might expect, you know. So an estimate kind of allows you an element of flexibility with the job. Whereas a quote would give a precise cost of any proposed work, including materials and labour, or it could be agreed that you're providing labour only for a set period of time for this much, you know. Yeah, a quote is an agreed set price. So improving customer care. So some of the ways we can make sure we don't get any complaints is by communicating well with the customer. Keep them up to date as to what's happening, what stage you're up to, how things are progressing. If they ask, if they come up and speak to you, and give them an explanation of what you're doing and sort of why you're doing it. Always be polite. And a good way of sort of ensuring that all of your employees, if you're an employer, act in a similar manner would be to produce a customer care policy statement, so explaining the way you want your staff to act. But whether you've got a policy or not, you should always make sure that you provide good aftercare, because that's the key to good word of mouth, really. Make sure the customer knows how to use the appliance before you leave. Even if it seems like it's straightforward, okay, explain to the customer how it works, what they need to do to program the heating, say for example. So verbally explain all the controls to them, as well as leaving the relevant information such as the manufacturer's literature, operating instructions and guarantee. Also, if you've commissioned the appliance, you'd also leave the benchmark book. So this is what the benchmark book might look like. Okay, it's filled out as part of the commissioning process and it should be left with the customer. Anyway, that's time for task 5.